Our protectors are the one that are generating most of these thoughts because they're trying to avoid fear, uncertainty, risk, and pain. This is the FERPA analogy that we spoke about in our Conscious Couples interview, I believe. And so, okay, if we understand our minds and our bodies are trying to avoid fear, uncertainty, risk, and pain, we understand now we're just kind of scripting out this narrative to repeat. You ever seen 50 First Dates with, oh my goodness. Adam Sandler's in this, and oh my God, I'm forgetting her name. The plot of it, I don't remember her name, but the plot is she gets a brain trauma from a car accident, and she wakes up every single day with a fresh slate. She doesn't remember anything from the day. So she wakes up every single day with the same script. So her parents had tried to prevent her from knowing that she had a car accident that totally released her from any sort of memory. Gives her the same paper every single day. And why I mention that is because what if we were to imagine that every single day we're kind of waking up like that? I'm not saying we all have brain injury, but we're repeating the same script every single day, again and again and again in our head. And we understand all of that. It's like, okay, well, let's get into the goods, because if we're literally scripting every single day those protectors, now we're aware that they happen. How do we actually get to the change component? This is where a lot of individuals, Shada, don't want to put in the work. And I'll just be real and honest with that, because this is where the work of actually cognitive behavioral therapy, IFS applying in the real world with real people and real consciousness start to come into play. Because if we're not aware of all those things that I just said, and we don't understand that it's our protectors that are driving the bus, then how are we going to set ourselves up for success to actually be able to make meaningful, positive, and sustainable? That's a key word that we always use at Evolve. Sustainable change. We can't. So now we know all that stuff. And here we have that one moment where, let's say, for example, we're going to use the experience of someone who's been traumatized by, let's say, friendships. That's a really big friendship wound that a lot of people carry. They get into their adult years. They've had a lot of trauma that, let's say, female friendships. They don't trust females, and they certainly don't trust pretty females. I've gotten that one coming to me from a client, like, I didn't trust you before because of all my past history. It's like, okay, awesome. Let's work with that.
Yeah.
We have a recognition of our thoughts. So this is where thought records come into play, which is a very handy dandy tool, which essentially says, what is the situation? What are those triggers? In this protector's mind, we recognize that the trigger is a woman, gender female. Every time I speak with a gender female, there's that script going, automatic negative thought, right? Unconsciously. She's going to hurt me. I'm not going to be able to trust her. We won't be able to connect. I won't be able to be heard, be seen, be valued. All of those unconscious thoughts. This is where I would have a client write down, okay, when that happens, what are the thoughts coming in? And I just kind of aired those out loud. So then we sit down and we say, okay, what are the emotions that are starting to come up? When we can attune to the emotions that are paired with those thoughts, that's what we have called feelings. The feelings then get our central nervous system all revved up. Kind of, we didn't realize, but we're tense in our shoulders. We're a little defensive and not willing to be as vulnerable. Yeah, exactly. The throat starts to get all tingly and tied up. And we recognize that. Yeah, that's a very common one. Okay, we have the triggers, the external triggers. We have the internal scripting, the monologue that happens, which what will happen if you get vulnerable. We have the emotions that then start to come up. This is when I like in the thought records that if you were to like Google them, you don't really see this a lot, but this is where I would ask you to ask what part is driving the bus of your thoughts. What part of you, this is where the protector comes in, believes that this person that you're meeting is going to do X, Y, and Z, right? That's called a cognitive distortion, where you're just jumping and distorting your thoughts before you can even have that self version of you present. So this question, Shada, that you ask is so important and so meaningful, and I'm long-winded on this one because it's critical. The change process, if we look at all of that, it's like, holy crap, that's a lot of work. Yes, that's why a lot of individuals don't do it, because it requires us to be present with ourselves, present with our parts, and recognize here's the protector. So this woman, right, for example, oh, I recognize Sandy. Let's refer to her protective manager part as Sandy. She goes on the proactive defense to not be vulnerable, to get that little tightness in her throat, to not really work through somatic releases before she connects with another woman. Okay. This is where the thought challenging technique comes in. The thought challenging technique is essentially asking, what if, or how true is this? And that's one of the best things you ask. Like for me, that's one thing that I use all the time. So for example, I give the microphone to my true self every single morning. I say, true self, you got this, girl. I know that the protectors are going to come in at certain points, and I give you the baton to make sure that you have this one thought challenging technique at all times. So at all times, I know that when my protectors get activated, true self has that permission slip that we talked about a little bit earlier today. The permission slip to say, how true is this? What if this isn't true? And that alone, that is where the thought challenging technique gets put into place. So if we were to just pause there and reflect upon just that one tiny technique, we'll think that change happens in big bangs. But the big bangs only happen after all these little moments of disciplined action, in the moments that are meaningful and microbial, so imperceptible to the eye, to the heart, to the mind. And that question slips right underneath the ego radar, right underneath the protector radar. And to be able to open ourselves up to possibilities that aren't just narrowed down in these automatic negative thoughts. And so if we open ourselves up to what if, or what else could be true, is another thing. That goes into having our parts work on the evidence gaining what else could be true. And if you ask those questions, your protector parts have to kind of answer. They might be like, I'm not interested. But more often than not, I haven't worked with a protector yet that is like, I'm not answering that, kind of in that. But it opens us up. And enough of those to kind of round this out, enough of those, Shada, in real time, that eventually opens up the vantage point of the protector to recognize that, oh, she's going on the defense. And we have enough evidence to recognize like that which I've been experiencing with other women, that actually hasn't been my experience. That's been my trauma clouding my lens and my protector interpreting and perceiving a situation that was distorted and not actually the reality. And so that enough over time, that's where we then begin the change process of asking the protector for a new role. And maybe that new role, for example, could be, can we collect the evidence or the data that can help us see women as trustworthy and worthy of connection and people who won't hurt us? And or can that protector then be able to switch roles of, can we be mindful of the syntax of which that protection goes in? And instead of protecting, maybe searching and maybe understanding and getting curious. So long-winded, but that is essentially it broken down in its finest.
Couldn't be explained better than this. This was beautifully broken down. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
the details.
Yeah.
What if you have gone through years of trauma and your protective parts are these giant, enormous monsters, and your true self is this big?
That's
Your
what it
true
feels
self
like.
like goes like this, and you're like, how? Okay, so in the explanation that you just gave, how this little true self is gonna now come up and say, is this true? Because now the protective part is so big and dominant, and the true self does not even know whether it's true or not anymore.
Yeah, that's it's really common for that, right? Because when these protectors, let's say, for example, they drive, they go through trauma, our protectors are more often than not, and this is kind of excluding individuals who are struggling with mental disorders or mental illnesses or challenges with that. And why I say that is just simply because of the way in which the thought process works. And so when our protectors are kind of created, it's in proportion to the pain that we experience. So if you have, let's say, for example, we were to put it on the ACE score, you have an ACE score of an 8. So childhood adverse experiences or adverse childhood experiences, that's a scale to kind of determine the quote unquote level of trauma that you've experienced. And obviously those are the more encompassing right now of our times, but there's definitely better scores to be able to understand. But let's say you have an A score of an 8 and it's a Likert scale out of 10, 8 out of 10. That means your pain in childhood and during development years was so horrible that the proportion to which your protectors developed is those big, really scary and almost bludgeoning of what feels like your true self, because it's not safe, right? That's the narrative that these protectors had to actually develop, because their actual reality was it was not safe for me to ever have a true self kind of come forward, because, and then insert what their experiences are, right? We have plenty of experiences right now where we're able to see headlines over the news where I can only imagine the level of protectors that individuals right now across the globe are experiencing, to where the true self feels that small. And the thing is, that is the reality of trauma, is it starts extremely small and it's going to feel wildly impossible to be able to have that grow over time. And I think that it's incredibly important as a practitioner to recognize that that is absolutely valid and that's absolutely fair. If you have a lot of trauma and you have stacking of traumas, likely it's not just the trauma itself, it's likely how you've tried to navigate life. So protectors, for example, that are that big have probably tried to adapt in ways that served you in the moment at the expense of maybe long-term you. So this is where like substance abuse and whatnot, risky behavior can come. So that little true self that's so small and like squeaking in their voice of like, please help, or we know that this is important, or whatever it is, it feels like a daunting task. And so the first step is validation to those parts that it's going to feel impossible. Now, this is where what's really important is to recognize that impossible or improbable, the improbability of that change happening in a short amount of time is improbable. And I think that that's fair, because when we just look at it from that math standpoint of the unconscious thoughts, you're talking about not just 90% of those automatic thoughts are negative, but they actually are rooted in a very biochemical bias towards safety and towards making sure there's no pain, there's no trauma to be experienced. So it's not just this like, it would be nice if, but no, we need to recognize that there's improbability to it, that change is going to happen right away. And that's where understanding that change is a process and subjective for each and every single person is critical. So someone might come to me and has, well, Emilia, I have decades of trauma that I am just now in my 50s coming to you, and I need change happen quick. And I understand. I get it. You need this change real fast. Here's the thing. The hard part is recognizing that it doesn't happen overnight, because what I would ask someone like that is, so you're telling me for 4 decades, 40 years, your entire central nervous system was developing in this protective mechanism, and you want that to change overnight? I'm like, yeah. I would never laugh at someone like that, because that tells me how big their pain is. However, the thought challenging techniques are exactly the same. It's just the approach of understanding this is where expectations when it comes to the change process are really critical. That protector that's going to not want to let go, that protector needs repetitions of safety and safe containers of what if this is true, or what else could be true, not just from a cognitive standpoint, but from a somatic standpoint as well, because their entire central nervous system is already set up to make those determinations and snap judgments so that you don't get 20 miles close to any fear or any pain that could be happening. So it feels impossible, and that needs to be validated. However, this is where improbability is where I like to kind of pull in that math component, because it does help recognizing that even if that true self seems 1% small or like 2 inches small, Over time, if you give enough repetitions within the time that you have, creating a safe container, repetitions over time does build to marginal gains and eventually big gains, right? That's where that big bang of change happens. But it's only because of that disciplined action. So their treatment plan might look a little bit different in terms of frequency, intensity, validation through that safety component, not just like, you're right, you're right, you're right, but really recognizing how much more painful and difficult it might be to really stand up, quote unquote, to those protectors.
What is the role of self-trust and self-compassion in this process?
Yeah. Self-trust, and the biggest role from my perspective and based on the work that I've learned is establishing safety, establishing internal safety. And what I like to refer to as intrapersonal or intrapart safety. And so what does that actually mean, Emilia? Well, when you have parts that are right, we talk about interpersonal relationships. So like our relationship is between person to person. Intrapersonal relationships are the relationship between self and parts, self and exiles, self and whatnot, or protective part and exile, right? So that's those kind of connections. Self is establishing a foundation of safety and knowing and compassion that allows that compassion to have the bedrock of safety and curiosity and expansiveness of what is the core of who you are. So without quote unquote a self, which by the way, we all have selves. It's just a matter of how much, to what you mentioned, how much have we been able to connect into, plug to, recognize, even validate that we do have a self, acknowledge, accept, etc. When that self is there, and as we work to deepen our connection with self, it is to establish safety, it is to establish compassion, and it is, from my perspective, to establish that intra-personal dynamics that allow safety to be a consistent, reliable, safe other that when we were younger, we didn't really have. So that unconditional love, if you will.
What is the difference, in your opinion, between the conscious trust and random trust?
Hmm. From the self or just in general,
In general,
diff parts? Mm.
in
Okay.
general, and in relation to other people, even.
Okay. Yeah. So conscious trust and random trust. Conscious trust is with self at the center point of one's decision making, whereas random trust, I think, is more of that leap of faith, maybe not true self at the center point, but it's kind of where those protectors just leap in and say, yeah, I'm going to trust this person. And random trust is showing up in a mathematically randomized opportunity. So I'm thinking about like someone in the subway, right? Like some subway in New York, in the metro. And there's this randomness that occurs where they have a person that says, hey, do you want to sit next to me? And the conscious trust might be true self saying to the parts and kind of like a just echo of, this person looks, quick snap judgment, looks to be someone that isn't giving me this seat, but I know that there's protectors that might be thinking that he wants something from me. So maybe I'm not going to take it. Conscious trust is saying, well, what is the probability of someone who's giving up their seat? This woman, let's just say, so she happens to be pregnant on the metro. She says, well, I know that there's protectors that don't want me to trust this person and are making up these narratives of why this person's offering my seat. Conscious trust is true self saying, and we're going to trust this person, that they have good intent and that they're just offering their seat on the metro because of all the circumstances that are here, not just what my protectors are saying, right? I'm pregnant, seat's open, it's busy metro, etc., right? Conscious trust, true self at the center point, making that decision point while also hearing from all the other protectors. Same situation, you have random trust. True self maybe is offline, for lack of better words, or is just not as present because this same woman is extremely tired. She's working 2 shifts. She is pregnant, let's say, still, and she is offered this seat. She has no capacity to put her true self back online and say, I'm going to evaluate this random moment from the standpoint of true self. And instead, I'm just going to jump into what in my protector, quick snap judgment ability, I'm going to trust this person wants to give me their seat. Like that thought level doesn't go deeper than just the surface so that there's an outcome obtained, because the capacity is really what's driving the ability to have true self at the present point.
I really like the way you said the true self is offline and put it back online. I love it.